Hi everyone, I'm Eoin Cooney. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ARROE. We're a battery tech startup. I also previously founded a company called Slinks, which is a smart luggage startup. Both companies required custom hardware development. When I first started ARROE, I remember being told you need $2 million to properly develop a hardware product. While this makes things massively easier, it can be done with less. We completed our first prototype for $10,000. In this talk, I'm going to walk you through the different options that are available to you, the pros and cons of each option, and the pitfalls you should avoid at all costs. To give you some context, I'm going to briefly explain what our hardware product is at ARROE. So Layer is a portable battery and charging hub. It's connected to and controlled by our mobile application via Bluetooth. It has USB-C power delivery and DC charging for laptops, and USB-A quick charge and Qi wireless for mobile devices. The connection between the laptop, between the app and Layer allows us to customize the voltage and current from the DC port to safely charge any laptop. It's the first product that can do this. We also created a battery cartridge system which allows the battery cells to be removed from the main unit. All of the firmware was custom developed. So some of the main challenges we faced during development were communication. Most engineers and suppliers we work with don't speak English. Keeping the unit cost in line with our target retail price and margins. Making the product as slim as possible while maintaining structural integrity. Finding really good battery cells for the right price. Thermal dissipation, and the seemingly never-ending firmware development that needed to be done. As I said, we built the initial product on a tiny budget, but that's only taking into consideration the cash element. If you really believe in what you're doing and you're persuasive enough, you can convince most people to work for equity or on the basis that they will get paid later. Fortunately, my whole career was spent working at companies that never had any budget for anything. So when I started my own business, I was used to doing everything on a shoestring. Not having cash makes everything extremely difficult, but it does train you to think very differently. You have to be very creative in every situation and constantly find ways to make progress without any money. If you love problem solving like me, it can be a very rewarding, albeit stressful experience, and you will enjoy the challenge, but it's not for everyone. I'd also like to add that you spend a lot of your time just trying to figure out how to keep the project going, which takes your focus away from product development and user experience. However, if you don't have a choice, then you have to just get on with it. In the rest of my time here, I'll cover technical founders, product crowdfunding, how to leverage your network, and how to choose the right suppliers, all of which will help you bootstrap your hardware startup without a big budget. So having a technical co-founder will make your life so much easier. I didn't have one, so I always had to outsource the actual development. And for the most part, engineers won't do this work for equity. They want to get paid. If you have a technical co-founder who can develop the product from scratch, then that can save you a lot of cash in the early days. Unfortunately, you won't find many people who can develop a hardware product from scratch because it requires so many skill sets. It depends on the product. But for ours, we needed a product designer, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, and firmware engineer just for the hardware. We also had to do all the software development. So although a technical co-founder probably can't develop the product alone, they will be able to communicate more effectively with the engineers who will be doing the development. And that's going to save you time and money. If, like me, you don't have a technical co-founder, you have a steep current learning curve ahead of you. At ARROE, I gave an engineer some equity to help us cobble together the very first proof of concept prototype, but it was made from parts from other products. So although that process showed us that the product could be made, it didn't show us how to make it. So we used this prototype to run a product crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo in order to raise enough money to do the full development and get to a point where the product was ready for production. I would strongly advise against this unless you have no other option. If you do want to do product crowdfunding, I would urge you to wait until your product is 100% finished and ready for production. And I'm going to explain why. First of all, you will only bank about 50% of what you raise from the campaign. The other half is going to go on platform fees and marketing. People don't just come to your campaign page, you have to drive them there, and that costs a lot of money. So imagine your product is going to retail for $100 and you give a 40% discount to the backers. They pay $60, but you only get half of that, so you bank $30. If your product costs more than $30 to make, you're going to make a loss, and that money has to come from somewhere else. If your product is completely finished and ready for production, then you should know the final cost per unit. But if it's not finished, then you have no idea what the final cost is, and there is a good chance that it's going to cost more than you think it will. If you use the crowdfunding money for development, then you won't have enough money to produce the actual units and ship them to the backers. In my opinion, this is what happens to most hardware crowdfunding campaigns, and this is why many never manage to deliver. Backers don't like to wait a long time for product, and they're very wary of long lead times, so they are less likely to back your project if your project's shipping date is far away. If you're ready to go and you can ship in 2 to 3 months, then people are much more likely to back your project and you will raise a lot more money. So when building a hardware product, your network is going to be your most valuable asset. I was fortunate enough to have a good network in place before I started ARROE, but if you don't have an existing network in place, you need to build one. You can do this by going to hardware events or consumer electronics trade shows when they reopen, and networking with as many people as you can. You can try reaching out to other hardware founders to ask for their help or advice. A lot of them will be happy to help because that is how the startup world works. You can access most people on LinkedIn, and I would highly recommend spending the time to build out your profile and network there. Every time you meet someone in person or online, you can add them to LinkedIn and expand your network. Having an extensive network will not only help you access the right people, but it will also allow you to get the recommendations from people you know and trust. When you're looking for suppliers or development partners, these recommendations are invaluable because they will save you from working with companies that you should avoid. And believe me, there are plenty of those. As a general rule of thumb, I only work with suppliers that come recommended from people I know and trust. I've heard so many stories about hardware companies being screwed over by their suppliers, and for a young startup, that can be a fatal blow. You will likely get inundated with emails and LinkedIn messages from suppliers who want to work with you, but I wouldn't waste your time filtering through these. My feeling is that you need to go through your contacts and spend the time to find the right suppliers. The most important decision you'll make as a hardware founder is what suppliers to use. Your suppliers have the power to make or break your startup, so choose wisely. First of all, you're going to need to decide how to develop your product. One option is to do this in-house or with freelance engineers, but considering the fact that you'll likely need multiple engineers to work on the product, this could work out extremely costly. If you can get those engineers to work for sweat equity, then this could be a good option if they have the necessary skills to do a good job. You will, however, have to manage them and the quality of their work, which is very difficult if you don't have a technical background. The next option is to pay a development firm to develop the product for you. Provided you pick the right firm, this is probably the easiest and fastest way to develop the product. And if you can afford it, I would recommend doing it this way. It is, however, the most expensive route and can cost millions depending on the product and firm you choose. But for the most part, a good firm might cost you a few $100,000 for a hardware product. In return, you get a dedicated team and a project manager who will guide you through the whole process and make it quite easy for you. One of the downsides of this option is that you probably won't learn much because you're not that involved in the development process, but you're really just a client. The next option is the cheapest, but it's also the slowest, hardest, and most risky. There are companies in China and probably elsewhere, I just know about the ones in China, who will develop a new product for you, provided you use them for production. They'll do it for a very low amount, say as low as $10,000, which seems great initially when compared to hundreds and thousands or millions of dollars. But there's a lot of drawbacks, and I'll go through some of them now. So first of all, communication is very difficult, and a lot of problems can and will arise from miscommunication. If you're not based in China, then it's very hard for you to stay on top of the development and know what is going on at any given time. Development can drag on much longer than expected, and you will encounter constant delays. The process is far less organized than if you're working with a fully paid development partner. They'll want to keep the firmware they develop for your product, which makes it almost impossible for you to switch suppliers down the line. If you want to own the firmware, you will have to buy it from them for, say, $20,000. On that note, I really stress how important it is to own your own firmware and stipulate this in your agreement with any potential supplier, or at least include a mechanism whereby you can buy the firmware for a fixed amount at a later date. The firmware is written in Chinese, which means that only Chinese-speaking firmware developers will understand it, which limits you in the future. Your project is not their sole focus. They're going to be working on multiple projects and manufacturing all at the same time, and their loyalty lies with whatever will bring them in the most revenue in the short term. You cannot expect to pay somebody $10,000 and get a dedicated team of people working around the clock for you. So you're going to have to work very hard to keep them focused on your project. With that in mind, I would say that if you're developing a product in China, you need to go and live there. Your presence will show them how serious you are about the project, but it will also serve as a constant reminder to your supplier to work on your project, and that you'll make a lot faster progress. So really you have two options: either spend a lot of money or move to China and work closely with the supplier yourself. So the same applies when you're preparing for production and making your first batch of units. Either you need to be there yourself overseeing everything, or you need to pay a lot of money to get someone else to do this for you. Ultimately, no one else cares about your project as much as you do. And that's worth keeping in mind. Initially, we thought our development partner was on top of everything, and that we didn't need to spend a substantial amount of time in China. But as the project started to encounter delay after delay, we lost patience and committed to moving there until it was complete. And the progress that we made while we were there was 4 times as fast as when we weren't there. So it's definitely worth doing. That brings me to another point. When it comes to development, everything will take twice as long as you expect it to, especially if you're doing this for the first time. It depends on the complexity of the products you're working on, but as a general rule, you should expect development to take 2 years if you have money. It took us 3 years because we had no money, no technical co-founder, and no experience building a hardware product. One would almost question how we did it all. The problem is when you're building a totally new hardware product that has never been done before, there's no precedent for how long it will take. To a certain extent, the whole process is trial and error. So as you need to figure out what works and what doesn't. You may find out that some things are just not possible and that you have to come up with alternatives. One benefit is that the more complicated the product is to make, the more difficult it is to copy, and the more likely you are to be able to patent it. For us, it was in the process of development, overcoming particularly difficult obstacles, where we identified the most patentable aspects of our technology. One of the benefits of developing your product with the same supplier that will manufacture your product is that they're more inclined to be flexible with smaller quantities. They've already invested a lot of time in developing your product, so they're keen to start manufacturing it. As a new startup, this will be one of your biggest problems when trying to source suppliers. They want large volumes. The bigger and more established the supplier, the higher quantities they'll require to work with you. And if you can't order those volumes, they're just not interested. They'll also want to know how many units you plan to order in your first year, so that they can gauge whether or not there's long-term value in working with you. If your initial order is very small, but you can forecast large volumes in year 1, then you might be able to convince them to work with you. That being said, you want to engage with the supplier that is of the right size for you. If they're too small, they won't be able to keep up with production capacity as your orders increase, but if they're too big, they will not prioritize you, and they'll always push you to the back of the queue in favor for bigger clients. So before you start building your product, be sure to do some patent searches for similar products or technologies. you might find that your brand infringes upon intellectual property of some other brand, which could cost you your actual company down the line if they sue you, especially if it's someone like Apple. You can either hire an IP lawyer to do this for you, or you can do it yourself. It just involves wading through incredibly dense documentation, but it's extremely worthwhile in the long run. If you're very lucky, you may find that nobody has patented anything close to what you're building. Highly unlikely, but possible. In which case, you should patent it as soon as possible, provided you think that the patent is actually going to be valuable. And if it's not going to be a valuable patent, there's really no point in patenting it at all. In many countries, you can also claim R&D tax credits against the money you spend on development. This includes money spent on salaries, on staff, working in product development. In the UK, where we're based, you can claim back up to 1/3 of your R&D spend in the previous tax year, so very much worthwhile. So that's bringing me to the end. In conclusion, I'd like to just reiterate a few points that you can see on the screen. You can spend millions or thousands developing a product, but there's always going to be a trade-off. When dealing with Chinese suppliers, communication is key. You have to adapt to how they communicate. You can start on a shoestring if you convince most people to work now and get paid later, but you're just kind of deferring the payment, not eliminating it. Not having enough money is very stressful and will take up a lot of your focus. Get a technical co-founder if you possibly can. Avoid product crowdfunding until you're production ready, and make sure that you're not going to make a loss on the product crowdfunding. Very important. Build and leverage your network. It's your most valuable asset. Only work with suppliers recommended by people you know and trust. If you can spend the money to develop with a partner in your own country, it definitely improves lead times, communication, everything like that, and you don't have to travel all the time. If you can't, be aware of the pitfalls before you start so that you can do damage control from day one. And if you're developing or manufacturing in China, go to China. Everything's going to take twice as long as you expect, unless you're like a complete pessimist. Find the right size manufacturing partner for your company. It's important. Be careful about IP infringement and claim back whatever you can for R&D. So that brings me to the end. So yeah, I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I think now it's just Q&A. Okay, so I've got a question here. It says, what's going on in Chinese factories at the moment? Are they back to normal? Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because we were in China when COVID kicked off. So it was quite a strange experience. And basically we were due to be spending the next couple of months, basically over March and April, in China, overseeing the initial production run of our first product. So as you can imagine, we really, really wanted to be there. And then we basically had to just leave because of COVID. But initially the Chinese factories kind of shut down, and then there was reduced capacity and stuff like that. But now they're all back to, the ones that survived effectively are all back in full swing. Getting some really nice positive messages. Thanks, really glad that you enjoyed the talk. 15 minutes isn't nearly enough to kind of get through this kind of content. There's just like a million different things. So if anybody wants any kind of advice at all, just reach out to me on LinkedIn or something. Like super happy to help. Let's have a look. So I am in the design for manufacturing process. What would you recommend for the process of scaling a product from prototype to many? I guess you mean like in terms of going into production? So I mean, once the product is designed for manufacture, it's effectively ready to go. And you need things like your BOM, Gerber, schematics, everything like that, to actually be able to give to the supplier, the manufacturer that you're going to work with. Like most manufacturers won't even talk to you until you have everything absolutely ready to go. But once you have those things, then you can basically start shopping them around to different suppliers that might be able to work with you. But obviously you want to pick the right supplier in terms of capabilities and what they're able to do. You want to check what they can do in-house and what they outsource. This is really important because like a supplier might tell you that they can make your product and they can do everything and stuff like that. I mean, especially like whenever you go to China and stuff like that. But then you have to visit the factory, because then you'll go to the factory and you'll realize that, oh, maybe they just do electronic engineering in the factory, but they outsource like battery cells, plastic, injection molding, like all the plastic work, stuff like that, all of the components. The more subcontractors there are in a chain, the more likely it is to break down, the more likely it is you are to have delays. Because basically if one of the elements of the chain breaks down, then you're just waiting for your product to be basically ready. So I think that that's kind of really crucial. I mean, it's impossible to kind of sum up that question or that answer like in a few minutes, but there's a lot to do. But yeah, feel free to ask me directly as well afterwards. What is the best time in terms of units to move on manufacturing? I'm not sure I understand that question correctly, but time in terms of units. I mean, you want to start as small as possible. So you want to make the minimum number of units you possibly can. That's my advice, because first of all, there's a million different things that can go wrong with the product after you've done the production, and you want to be sitting on 10,000 units that aren't 100% perfect. Also, stock is cash, basically. So you're just sitting on a pile of cash that you've spent on this stock. And if you can't shift it fast enough, you could kill your company, because, as any company will know, cash is absolutely critical. So yeah, you really want to keep your initial cost down to an absolute minimum. If you're maybe wait until you get like actual purchase orders for larger volumes before you start manufacturing like big kind of quantities of stock. And then you can even you don't even necessarily need your own cash to pay for those purchase orders. You can use trade financing and stuff like that, which will actually finance the purchase orders for you. I think hopefully that answered your question. In terms of going to production, exactly, I had many suppliers based in China, but I do not know how to test them. Yeah, I mean, I think, so first of all, you need to go there. That's like the best advice I can probably give is like go to China, maybe even try to find somebody who's a local, who knows the lay of the land and can go to these suppliers with you and speak to them in Chinese and stuff like that. A lot of the time, some of these factories will do this thing where basically they kind of put on a show for you, like as a potential customer. So you go in and like there's loads of people working there and it's super busy and all this kind of stuff. And then as soon as you leave, like the factory kind of empties out. So you kind of have to be pretty careful about it. And you can check like what kind of certifications and stuff like that factories have. Like there are ISO certifications in terms of output, like how they treat their employees, stuff like that. But really you have to kind of go over there. And then you can also potentially test them out if you want by getting them to do samples for you and stuff like that. It's a lot better and easier than kind of going into manufacturing. But in my honest opinion, I would not really work with a factory unless they've come kind of recommended, or unless you can kind of get some kind of recommendation ideally. Or at the very least, if you have found them, then chances are they're probably pretty good. If they found you, chances are they're probably not so good. Because if you're a good factory and you have loads of business, you don't really need to spend a lot of your time going out trying to find new customers. But if you're not a great factory and you don't have any business, then you're going to spend a lot of time chasing down people on like LinkedIn and emails and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a general rule. If it's like you find the supplier rather than allowing them to find you, if that makes sense. What do you think about licensing your idea patent instead of manufacturing? Yeah, I mean, licensing is obviously like another route. I mean, you can basically license you can license as well as manufacturing, or instead, you need to have to license. You need to have like rock solid patents and IP protection, because most of the time, I mean, it really depends on the technology, so it's a hard thing to say, but most of the time, there's a way around it, like, frankly. So it's like you build something, you patent it, but that doesn't mean someone else, like, patenting is just it's just patenting the route you chose to develop a technology, but there's always going to be another way. Usually there's always a way to find another route. I guess it works if your route is like the best route and every other route is like way more expensive or time consuming, or it's not as good for the user, then that's great. But I think patents are important, but like, I don't know, the licensing game, it's really hard. You have to like go out and find clients and stuff like that. You're very much at the whim of these other companies. It's like, in a way, it's like much less risky because you're not like, there's no like outlay aside from the patent fees and stuff like that. You're just spending money on the patents, and you don't have to go into manufacturing and buy a load of stock, put into market, do marketing, all that kind of stuff. So it's like a completely different business model. Yeah. So I think it's just a personal preference. Like, do you really want to have your brand in the market, or do you want to like see other people integrate it into their technology? So next one. So I mean, from early trials. Okay, I think I answered that one. Sorry. So I've used 3D printing for prototypes because injection molds are so expensive up front. Absolutely agree with that. Like, don't do injection molding until you absolutely need to. But 3D printing is too expensive per item. Are you aware of anything between? Yes, there are. So injection molding. So basically, there's the 3D printing element, which I agree is fantastic for prototyping, but it's too expensive per unit. And then there's basically hard tooling, which is injection molding using steel, I believe. But there is an in between. So if you do the hard tooling, you'll get like hundreds of thousands of units out of it, and it's going to cost tooling maybe like $30,000, something like that. But there is an in-between option, which is soft tooling, and you can basically do soft tooling. You can do it is cheaper, but it won't last as long. Basically, the tools themselves won't last as long; they'll wear down faster. So there are basically options, but yeah, it's a tricky one, the tooling thing, because it is really expensive. Yeah. Hopefully that's an answer for your question. Once you've completed production, how do you decide on which markets to enter? Do you enter many or only one or two major? What factors the most restricting? Certifications, marketing, what are the costs are? So that's a big question. So I think in terms of the markets that you want to enter, I mean, it really depends on where you're based, your product, and what market you're targeting. I mean, when you build the product, you must have a target in mind, like a target customer. So then think to yourself, like, okay, where are the most of those people effectively? So for us, it's like, we're an English-speaking company. So, everything that we've done is in basically English. So we're like, okay, the easiest markets to start off are English-speaking markets. So initially we're starting off in like the US and UK, and like kind of going into Europe. And that's because obviously we can just kind of do one product, like our app is in English, our packaging is in English, all that kind of stuff, and target it towards the US and the UK. The US is the biggest consumer market in the world. So, and it has the most money. So like, it makes sense to basically kind of go into that market. There are a lot of it's so expensive to like launch a new product, and like certifications are indeed a factor. You know, you have to get certifications. Like we have to get general certifications, and then we have to get certifications to go into pretty much every single country, and certifications for kind of Bluetooth, battery certification, stuff like that. So it is kind of like a cost benefit analysis. And you probably don't want to try and get into every market like all at the same time. So hearing from someone else's. Oh, okay, that's cool. Yeah, so I think I'm out of time, maybe. I think, and that's been really cool and great. And thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, if anyone has any kind of more questions or wants more detailed answers or connections or contacts and stuff like that, feel free to reach out to me directly as well. Thanks. Bye.